This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Learn more at brex.com/techcrunch24. Payroll can be a hard thing for small businesses to manage. Whether it's knowing how to withhold taxes or making sure employees get their checks on time, there was a time when everything was handwritten and prone to manual errors. This week's company has found a way to make this, along with other employee benefits, much easier for small businesses.
You're listening to Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. And today we're talking to Josh Reeves from Gusto, a payroll benefits and HR company. I'm Becca Skutak, and here to talk about getting paid on time is my fabulous co-host,
Dominic Midori Davis. And before we get into our conversation with Josh, we have our two truths and a lie. And at the end, we'll tell you which one of these statements isn't true. So listen carefully. Is a lie that Gusto once had a different name, that Gusto is Josh's first company, or that Gusto's co-founders all studied engineering?
Ooh, listeners, you'll have to keep listening on to find out which one of these statements are true and which one is not. But before we do that, a quick reminder to rate and review the show. You can do so wherever you are already listening to this episode, and we greatly appreciate it on our end. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Josh. Hey Josh, how's it going?
Howdy, excited to spend some time together.
We are as well. And while I know many people listening in the audience right now probably are already familiar with your company, we should still start there anyway for those who are not. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Gusto?
Yes, I'm the CEO, co-founder of Gusto. We got started 13 years ago. We still view ourselves as early in the journey. And what we love doing is helping small, medium-sized businesses succeed. That means we do things like payroll, health benefits, all the stuff connected to building a team, getting started. Our goal is to help these small businesses thrive.
Definitely. And I'm curious, what led you to found this company? Maybe if you want to talk a little bit about your background and what got you interested in this space to begin with.
Yeah, so we were started 3 co-founders, me and 2 other folks, all very involved and engaged in Gusto today. All of us studied electrical engineering back in school. First off, you can wonder, how does 3 folks who studied electrical engineering end up in this space?
Right.
There are 2 bridges here. One bridge is we had all run prior small businesses, startups. So I had a small business. Before Gusto, we had a few employees, a few contractors. I had set up payroll. I had set up benefits. My co-founders happened to have similar experiences with their own startups. So that was one kind of catalyst for us to even be aware of, hey, there's something here that seems broken, painful. It could be made better, easier. And then the other is having family who worked in small businesses. When we talk to folks, usually everyone has some connection to small business. We definitely did through our parents, through my mother-in-law. And so those are the 2 kind of catalysts that got us interested in, hey, there's something here about how companies get formed and started and how they build a team and how they stay compliant that we think we can make a lot better.
And I'm curious, with all that being said, what stood out to you as the real problem here when you guys were going to get started? Like, what did you guys set out to solve? And maybe if you want to talk about why you guys ended up choosing the approach that you did.
Yeah. Companies can have all these big visions. Founders can have all these big dreams. But yeah, what do you start with? What do you do from day one? We were just 3 people. And so obviously we couldn't do all of our goals at the same time. It started for us really focused around payroll and specifically not just having that, personal and family pain point. We did some research. We talked to folks. We got out of our own house that we were living in with a bunch of roommates. And it turns out a lot of folks had the same type of pain we did. So there's about 6 million employers in the United States. And when we started Gusto, close to 40% of those companies would get fined or penalized every year for incorrectly doing their payroll taxes, just as one example. So you had people that had to do something. It wasn't why they started their company. They were doing it manually. They were making mistakes. The government was fining and penalizing them. And people would share with us very viscerally their frustration of how much time this was taking, how frustrating it was. And that's what got us excited. Not that we want people to be in pain, but we said, hey, maybe we can make this better. We have some ideas of how to go fix this problem.
Definitely. And I've actually been spending a lot of time in the startup compliance area as of recently. So I definitely was excited to talk to you about this because you obviously, like you just mentioned, are a big player in this space. How do you guys think about approaching compliance, both for yourselves as well as this companies underneath you? Because as you mentioned, a lot of companies really struggle to get this right. Yeah. It's really hard. Everything I learned while reporting that story was that it was somehow more complicated than I thought. Each person I talked to got even more and more complicated. So how do you guys think about approaching that and kind of making sure you're covering all of your bases and being able to kind of adapt as those rules do change for the underlying companies that you're working with?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. They keep changing. right? So I'll get into the kind of story behind it in our approach. But, we talk a lot about compliance inflation right now. There's over 15,000 new local, state, and federal rules that are created for how a business kind of navigates just existing. And part of that, if you kind of want to deconstruct it, is the origin of the United States, right? It's a very decentralized origin. There's the local, state, federal. These are different jurisdictions. You can have it the city, town, county, state, and federal. And so these aren't really coordinated. They all have different goals, different objectives. You have different agencies. So that's kind of why there is so many different rules and requirements. And then when you connect with a small business owner and entrepreneur, very quickly you realize they didn't start their business because they want to go navigate rules and requirements.
Right.
They started their business because they had an idea of something they wanted to go build, a product they wanted to go sell, a service they wanted to go offer, oftentimes in their local community, because these are small businesses. And then they realized, oh my God, I have to do all these other things too. I'm already so busy. And they don't have the resources to go hire someone or have a bunch of specialists or experts. And so, that's kind of the way it's been for a long, long time. And technology software companies historically would focus more on bigger companies because this small business customer segment wasn't very accessible. We had a hypothesis, and it's been, I think, proven true so far that, now is finally a time when small business, you could actually bring great, amazing modern software to this segment, solve the pain, and then actually build a great business within this category.
What was it like building a company like this? You started it like 13 years ago. I imagine that at the time you were using some type of AI, but it probably wasn't being called AI. So what was the process of building, I guess, the software in a company like this?
Yeah, I think the first thing with any business is, we didn't start the company for our benefit. It's to go help our customers. We immediately started talking to customers. Even though we were based in Silicon Valley, we actually were really focused on mainstream small business. I love reminding folks there's more dentist offices in the US than tech startups. And so we would go out and meet them, talk to them, interview them, get feedback. And then, we use technology. That's our background. Back then, we would point to things like cloud and paperless and mobile. Nowadays, we would point to things like AI. These are all, I think, tools is kind of the way I would describe them. And small businesses aren't going to be the ones to go build or integrate these tools. But if we can do that and create a product that is really easy to use, because they don't care about those terminologies. What they care about is that it works, it's compliant, it's accurate, it's easy to use, easy to set up. And that was kind of what we got started building to start. We had our first 10 or 15 customers, which were folks we knew. It was a very manual process to begin. We were just in California, just focused on new employers, just focused on full-time employees. So we had to scope the problem really narrow to make sure that we had built something actually useful. And then once we had that product live and customers told us, hey, this is amazing, it makes my life so much easier, then we knew we were onto something interesting. And then it was about how do we scale this to obviously more complex businesses across California. Then it became how do we scale this to more businesses across the United States? We had these waiting lists of folks waiting. And it was really important we did it in a very intentional way because the product we offer isn't something that can work some of the time. Like we're actually making sure people get paid on time so they can make rent. Or a few years later, we launched health benefits. We're setting up healthcare for folks so that, if they're sick or their kid is sick, they're going to have coverage. So there's always been a balance at Gusto of making sure we iterate and learn and launch quickly, but also making sure that it's done in a very responsible way.
And I'm curious, what was it like scaling, especially with the focus that you guys do have on sort of, when you say small, medium businesses, we talk to people who say that stuff all the time and they exclusively mean startups. But it sounds like that's not what you guys mean. You guys mean like anything that would fall under the small, medium business category. But that's a super fragmented market. What was it like expanding out of the Bay, finding these different companies to work for? And did you find there was like an education element or a lot of outreach? Like, how did you manage to scale in the beginning as people weren't sure who you guys were and the kind of businesses you were targeting in general?
Yeah, so we can build a good product, but if we don't have a way to get customers, right, we're not going to be a big business ourselves. Especially because we were focusing on smaller business, there's less revenue per customer. And the playbook for a larger customer would have been, high touch outbound sales, go meet with them face to face, stuff like that. That does not work. It's not cost effective in a smaller business context. So we knew we had to build a product that was just really, really delightful, easy to use, where customers would be able to get so excited and it had to be true or not that they would want to tell others about it. So word of mouth and referrals, that organic momentum, actually even today is one of the biggest sources of lead volume for Gusto. So yeah, we went live in December of 2012. Within that first month, we had 100 customers, and the vast majority of them we never had met. They were spread across California, companies we had never interacted with, and they had heard about us from initially the article that was written about Gusto. And then as people started using the product, they heard about it from someone else saying, hey, you should try Gusto. They're really easy. At that point, we had a different name, actually, but we can maybe talk about that later. But it was word of mouth and really organic. That was the fuel. We didn't do any paid acquisition for our first year after launching because we wanted to figure out, had we built a really amazing product? After a year, we then started doing more ad purchasing to augment that organic. But for any entrepreneur that's focused on small business, I actually like the purity of building for small business because you have to build something that's really useful that customers love to get that word of mouth. Otherwise, your go-to-market is not going to scale.
Another question about that is that I'm not the first person to tell you this. You've probably noticed this on your own, but there have been a lot of companies that launch focused on small businesses that, like you mentioned, the ticket sizes are not very large. You're not making a ton of revenue off of each customer when you do target a market like that, who have since moved upstream, working with big clients. Some have even stopped working with small and medium-sized businesses. And of course, you guys are all doing slightly different products. But how have you guys thought about sticking to that mission and being able to grow at the same time and not necessarily abandoning that in the name of reaching a higher number potentially?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's, are you building a good business, right? And then we keep expanding our segments. So we used to be just 1 to 10 employees in California. Now I would describe Gusto as being a great product for 1 to 500 person companies in all of the United States. But the reality is there's 6.2 million employers in America. 4 million are less than 5 employees, right? Over half are less than 5 employees. So, I mean, the quick answer without getting into too much detail is, you have to be a good business. We measure that through things like gross margin, CAC payback, net dollar retention. And I think one of the advantages we had is when you look at payroll specifically, we've broadened into many other products now that work with payroll, but it's really the least optional part of the stack. I think if someone is building a product that is more optional or, maybe more of a vitamin than medicine, then there's that kind of choice. If the economy turns, do you keep paying for this product or not? With payroll, if you don't pay someone as an employee, they'll quit. So it's not a vitamin, it's medicine. You have to have it. And so that basically enables us to be, a much stickier, much more kind of connected partner to our customer. And it enables us to have a really good business. So what I love is that, used to be able to only point to companies like Intuit and say, hey, look, here's a software company that's built a big business, over $100 billion market cap in SMB. But now you can point to a lot more companies like us or Square or Shopify, et cetera, who just, again, highlight how big this small business market is.
And I know we definitely want to talk to you more about the expansion of the company. Well, first of all, I feel like you kind of have to tell us the first name of the company that you had. Like, you kind of just dropped that. Like, what was the name of Gusto before this?
Yeah, our first name was Zen Payroll. And the story there is pretty, I think, classic early stage startup. We were 3 people. We were all writing code. We're trying to build out the first payments engine, the first, direct deposit and tax system. And so, we were part of Y Combinator, which is an incubator program I'm sure you both know of. And so we had demo day coming up and we had to choose a name. And it was like the least, like probably 20th on our list of priorities. But you still have to have a name to actually go, present your company and have a domain that you can put your website on. And so we just looked at GoDaddy, found like zenpayroll.com for $7 a month, bought it and went back to writing code. And so I think that's a great reminder to founders, like there's definitely things you can overthink and you got to just be ruthless with prioritization. That said, we kind of also felt like, hey, probably we would potentially see ourselves changing this name in the future because we do plan to launch additional products and we want a name that's more flexible. And so we actually had thought of the name Gusto a few years later, and then we didn't announce it till 2015 because we wanted to announce it with a big product launch. So when we launched health benefits in 2015 and really now had 2 big products in market, that's when we announced the shift to Gusto. And then we had about 10,000 customers at the time and about like 150 Gusties. That's what we call ourselves. And we spent 3 days calling every single customer. The entire company had phones at their desk, and we basically called customers to let them know, A, that we're still the same company, like nothing has changed, just a different name. And then B, we've launched this additional product and we're excited to help them with more pain points in their life.
Oh my gosh, that's actually so funny. What were the Gusties called before?
I think we called ourselves, it's all organic. The team comes up with it, but Zen Payrollers, maybe I think was one that people liked. But yeah, Gusties definitely float off the tongue. And Gusto, I think of names as just like vessels, right? You fill it with meaning by how you serve the customer. But we liked the association with like, you can build with Gusto, you can work with Gusto, you can live with Gusto. There's like that energy, that optimism, that positivity that, we see in our customers all the time, despite how challenging it is to run a small, medium-sized business.
I always love, I do love hearing the stories about companies that expand to work into healthcare because we were talking about compliance and there's like so much like red tape within healthcare. And so I wanted to know, like on your side, expanding into an industry like that, was there a lot of red tape or a lot of hoops that you had to go through in order to expand into that sector and offer that services to a lot of small businesses?
Yeah, that's the nature of health benefits. We are a broker, so we work with folks like Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Kaiser, all the major carriers out there. We make it easy for a small, medium-sized business to go offer healthcare to their employees. And a lot of times with our customers, they're smaller. They didn't even realize they could because a lot of other brokers just want to go serve bigger companies. And with Gusto, we're happy. We have a great, efficient way with technology and great benefits advisors to help smaller businesses with the same pain point. But it's actually quite analogous to payroll, where in payroll land, it's not just software. You have all the local, state, federal tax agencies, all the different forms and filings, plus all the money movement. And we move well over $1 billion a day at this point as a part of our payroll system. Within health insurance, you have all the insurance carriers. And kind of like if you want to imagine a tax agency is not the most tech-savvy entity out there, insurance carriers are also not the most tech-savvy entities. They have good intent, but they don't have the best API. They don't have the best portals. And so a lot of times the business owner is, again, navigating a lot of paperwork, a lot of process. And so there's kind of an analogous, hey, let's take all this complexity. Let's focus on like what we can abstract so that the business owner then can focus on what makes their business better. And a lot of the products we've launched, whether it's benefits or time tracking or 401k or workers' compensation insurance, et cetera, it's really customers asking us, can you help us with this thing? And then because the payroll system is the de facto employee system of record, we can actually launch these additional products in a way that is easier, simpler for our customer to use than if they were to choose a third-party kind of separate siloed experience.
And one follow-up to that, I'm always curious when we talk to founders who have expanded either into different geographies or different product lines, how did you know it was the right time to expand into healthcare? And of course, it wasn't like a snap decision or anything, but how long had you guys been thinking about it? How did you know it was the right time? And some of the other areas you guys have expanded to as well. How do you guys think through timing when it comes to expanding into these other product lines?
Yeah, your question's around kind of prioritization. I think this is actually kind of one of the more tricky but important topics for founders and leadership teams to spend time on because, we have this vision of what the future looks like. We have a point of view on how the employer-employee relationship evolves. We have a point of view on how we want to make it easier for people to start companies and survive and thrive. But, what do we do now versus later, right, is really what prioritization is all about. And for us, that falls into not just product prioritization, which products we build now versus later, but also, to your point, geography, where do we serve customers now versus later, and also company sizes. And then you have lots more cuts, industry type, growth rate. So definitely don't have a crystal ball. I guess the most important thing is companies need to have a really decisive way to put stakes in the ground on what matters now versus later. So like most companies, we use, planning as a part of that. We do these 3-year planning arcs to kind of make it really clear what our kind of focus is going to be in the next 3 years. But then within that, we have, a rolling 18-month product roadmap. And to make it real, early on, all we did was payroll. And we had a choice when we were live in California and growing quickly. Are we going to launch more products or are we going to take payroll nationwide? Because of the nature of multi-state, where if you hire one employee in California, one employee in Texas, you have to use the same system for both of those employees. We knew we had to get to multi-state. So it actually took us a couple years. And all the other products we wanted to build, we kind of delayed on until we could get to all 50 states in the 2015 timeframe. But at that point, same decision. We had to choose, are we going to go now bring payroll to more countries or launch additional product lines? And there was just such strong pull and demand from our customers to go do benefits in particular that we really prioritized continuing to improve and scale payroll in America, but also then getting into health benefits. There's a lot of different, I think, rules of thumb here. When you're really small as a company, doing too much can really be a distraction. And there's definitely a shiny object syndrome that can affect companies in Silicon Valley, in my opinion. Once you get to sufficient scale, and Gusto now has, several hundred million of revenue, free cash flow positive, we can actually do many different product lines, but in parallel with different app teams that are kind of working at the same time in parallel with each other. So it becomes a little bit easier as you get to bigger scale, but that pitfall is still there to try to do too much all at once. On the flip side, there's a pitfall to do too little. And we are still early. We are still very ambitious. We want to go launch many, many more product lines, serve millions of businesses. So I feel that urgency every day.
And one thing I wanted to ask you about is the timeline of the company, because knowing when you guys got started and thinking about where we are now, there's been quite a change in how people think about remote work, how people think about hiring, how people approach these things, both due to the pandemic, but also just due to how technology was changing even in the years prior to that. How have you guys been able to kind of adapt and meet the moment as these things have come up and people's relationships to these types of providers and these kinds of software applications have changed?
Yeah, there's an angle here on Gusto, which I'll comment on, but then also for our customers. I mean, I think what's interesting is technology keeps changing, society keeps changing, the nature of work keeps changing. I used to say, Gusto, when we were less than 10 employees, adopted Slack. And so we were Slack native. And, that gave us a certain way of collaborating, working that was different than companies who had been more email native. And we use email at Gusto, but it never was kind of a debate on how do we use email versus Slack. It just felt very intuitive to us from the beginning because of when we started. Now you can talk about companies that are AI native. And obviously we're also cloud native, et cetera. And so I think part of it's just having a mindset of iteration, right? Like what worked in the past might not work again in the future. And from a even, hybrid distributed lens, we used to be entirely in person. We now have multiple hubs of Gusties. Some are with offices, some don't have offices. And so enabling that digital collaboration becomes really important as well. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think founders thinking about this should not think there is the right or wrong way, but it's really just spending time to figure out what's right for your business, what's working, and then iterate. And if it's not working, then you have to change.
And definitely want to talk about what you were doing before Gusto. I know that you worked at Zazzle, you had a company before this as well. And so wanted to talk about building that first company you had, what it taught you about entrepreneurship, being a founder, and the lessons you took from it that you brought over to Gusto.
Yeah, I mean, my first real entrepreneurial experience was actually in college. I started a nonprofit with a friend. And I remember spending, up till 4 a.m, telling everyone I knew about what we were doing. We were trying to bring together students from the US and China to build tighter relationships, to go do service projects, mostly, teaching English and computer literacy in rural parts of China and also computer literacy in the US. And that was just super fun, super energizing. It wasn't a job. No one was getting paid. Then I worked as a product manager at Zazzle. That was a chance to really learn how to build software in a professional setting. And then, my first startup was 2008. It was a company that, really not a company, a project that we got started when Facebook platform went live. And this is when, iPhone had just come out in 2008. I described that 2-year chapter as a very reactive chapter. We were building different apps on the Facebook platform, tools for people to post products into their feeds, et cetera. But we really didn't have a mission or a vision. We just kind of were optimizing and iterating a lot. And after 2 years, basically telling all my friends we're in stealth, we ended up selling the company. And I had to go through a lot of reflection to figure out what had felt awkward or uncomfortable about that chapter. And for me, there's no judgment here on others that might have different approaches to company building. But one takeaway I had juxtaposing that startup compared to the nonprofit chapter was I hadn't started with a purpose. I had started with just an optimization loop. And so that's why I advise founders especially, and definitely it was a huge part of how we approached building Gusto early on. There has to be something broken, painful, not your pain point, but a customer pain point to have a reason to exist. And then there has to be the ability to go make it better and then scale it and have a good business model. But I always like to tell folks, imagine it's the 10,000th time you're describing what you're doing. Will you be as excited as the first time? And if a founder can't be as excited as the first time, it's going to show. And so for me, this passion to tackle and help small businesses, enable entrepreneurship, enable better, more effective teams, is what I would like to spend the rest of my professional life making better. I can't fake that at this point, 13 years in. It's just truly what I love doing. And I'm really grateful for that. But again, that's something that I think founders can think about more intentionally early in the journey, especially if they do want to spend decades building something. If they want to do it only for a couple of years, then probably there's a lot of other approaches out there.
No, that's such an interesting way to think about it too, because it sometimes seems like we get two camps of founders on the show. It'll be the founder being I saw this problem or this gap for my children. I went out and I built this thing and I'm super passionate about it because I'm passionate about them in this area. But then you also get founders who are I saw a really good opportunity. I saw the writing on the wall. So I hopped in. And it would be interesting to kind of compare how those companies end up at the end of the day. I'm sure some of the non-passion driven ones do well, but I'm curious what that split would look like.
I mean, maybe obviously both could probably work. The thing to avoid is someone being in the first bucket, but telling themselves they're in the second, or being in the second bucket and telling themselves they're in the first. So I think it's just being transparent with what is the drive? What is the motivation? And again, for me, if me and my founders, we were in our late 20s, we wanted to tackle a problem that we could see ourselves spending the rest of our professional life making better. It just had to be a problem space that we got really deeply inspired and motivated about. And we happened to learn about it through our own experience. But we also needed to see that it was something a lot of other folks felt pain around. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be something we could spend decades on, right? If it's just a problem we're experiencing uniquely, we probably could fix that within a few days or weeks. But if we're going to go help millions of businesses out there. We have lots of work to do. We're still early.
I love a roundabout way to describe picking a business that has product market fit. Because yes, if you're only solving for yourself, that's a pretty small market.
More from this conversation right after a quick break.
This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Brex knows cash is king for startups, so they built a banking experience that takes every dollar further. Unlike traditional business banking solutions, Brex has no minimums and no transaction fees, and you can get 20 times the standard FDIC protection. Even better, you can earn industry-leading yields from your first dollar while still being able to access your funds anytime. Get the business account trusted by 1 in 3 U.S. startups at brex.com/techcrunch24.
Speaking of the market, since you guys got started, there's been a lot of players entering this space. Like you guys were probably one of the first to launch payroll, especially focused on the small business side. But it's become somewhat crowded since then. There's been a lot of new entrants and a lot of people either launching in that space or expanding in that space too. How do you guys think about competition and sort of making sure you're keeping the messaging right and keeping that hold on the market the same, even as more players do enter the space?
Yeah, one thing just to note on market, and then I can share more about our approach. The reality is the space we're in, and we're kind of connecting multiple spaces, has been around forever. There's companies like Intuit that focus on parts of what we do. That's a $100 billion company. There's ADP that focuses on parts of what we do. That's a $100 billion company. There's Paychex that focuses on parts of what we do. That's I believe, over a $50 or $40 billion plus company. So this pain point has actually been massive for a long time, is my point. What's interesting is it's actually been very fragmented as a market. So the three folks I just mentioned, when you add up their market share, it's about half of the employers. But when we started Gusto, if you remember, I mentioned 30 to 40% were doing it manually on pen and paper. So there's been this big greenfield part of the market that's mostly smaller and new employer centric. That's where we've been focusing, and that's how we can keep gaining lots of market share and also have folks switching on to Gusto from ADP, Paychex, Intuit. But then to your point, there's obviously going to be new entrants and startups that see this big market opportunity and also are taking different angles to it, right? If you think about the broader, small business back office, you have banking as a component, you have accounting and bookkeeping, you have credit card and spend management, you have payroll, you have benefits, you have all these different categories. And so I guess for us, I would just say, we really believe very strongly that starting with payroll is a very big advantage. It's the least optional part. It's where a lot of the data and transactions sit. That was very strategic. And then second, now that we've made this progress, we serve over 300,000 businesses in America. We need to be really aggressive and definitely the hunger is there. We need to keep pressing our advantage, right? Pressing our advantage with product quality, pressing our advantage with product innovation, adding additional product lines. And if we can just maintain our advantage, that's how I think companies win in the market. If there wasn't other really top-notch businesses entering our space, then I'd be worried that somehow we're the only ones that knew it was an interesting market. It's always been a huge market opportunity, and we welcome the competition. We want to compete and win based on the merits and quality of our product.
And this is one of our favorite questions to ask people. So basically, you've been around for a bit. You have 2 companies. Do you have any funny mishap stories from your time building either, this company or your last one? What are some funny mishaps that have happened that now you look back on and they're funny, but maybe at the time they were not funny?
There's definitely mishaps and there's definitely funny things. I'm trying to think in our space, funny mishaps are like 2 separate circles. So I'll try to share maybe both, but you tell me if they're funny mishaps versus just funny or just a mishap. So I remember early on, we were working with a banking partner. I want to say it was Christmas Eve. We use ACH to process payroll, and there was just an issue with our banking partner. They made a mistake, and people were not going to get paid on Christmas Eve. And so I guarantee you nothing was funny about that in the moment, and maybe at all, period. Again, you have to tell me if any of this answers your actual question here. But, this is where Gusty's, our purpose is to help our customers swarmed really quickly. We were able to use wire transfers to make sure people could get paid on time. Obviously, folks were buying Christmas presents for their kids. So it was really important they had their salary and their income in their bank account available to them. And so that was definitely just a stressful moment that happened early on when we were all trying to kind of spend time with our families. And I was just really proud of how the team came together to help our customers. Maybe something funny. I know people like this kind of tradition at Gusto, or at least talk about it. We started the company in a house that we were all living in with roommates. The three founders, we were all raised taking our shoes off at home. And so when we moved to an office in San Francisco, we had hired a few teammates. We kind of kept that tradition. The team really wanted to keep it. So we had shoe racks, and you'd walk around the Gusto office with slippers and socks. We would pass out slippers to people when they came into our office as guests. We actually kept that tradition up to 2020, the pandemic. So, 1,500 gusties in multiple office locations, walking around in socks and slippers. Not something we recommend for every company, but something that was authentic to Gusto. That's now more of an optional policy post-COVID, but definitely I know some folks thought that was pretty funny and interesting in terms of our history.
Okay, but that's something I would do as well, because I'm a very no shoes on in the house type of person.
Yeah.
I am pro that policy. I'm going to steal that policy, actually, and I'm going to launch a company and just do that.
I mean, a lot of times with traditions, it's like what feels organic and natural and then takes off, and like it's not a big extended thought process. Folks that do it in their home get it really quickly. And again, folks that don't do it at home, we would make it very easy to wear, slippers or indoor shoes that you just walk around the office in. So yeah, that's just a fun tradition that the company's had over the years.
I love a house shoe, so I'm in full support of this. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit about how you guys have been able to build the company itself. You mentioned you started out with 2 co-founders. Now you have a huge team. You've sort of expanded across all these different areas. What has it been like building the team and sort of maintaining the culture as you guys have built the company?
Yeah, we're around 2,600 Gusties at this point. So definitely team effort. Maybe one thing I'll talk about, I think that really we tried to be very intentional about is, the team building process itself. When we were 3 people hiring our first employee, we thought a lot about what about the way we're working do we want to propagate and keep? Because the 3 of us had been working at that point together for several months. And, a lot of times early on in a company, you want to go write more code, you need an engineer. You want to go do more, content marketing, you need to hire a content writer. You want to go do XYZ action. You can go get really focused on the skill. Like, does this person have that skill? And skill matters. Don't get me wrong. If you only hire for things like values and motivation, you have a lot of cheerleaders. So skill is important. But we quickly added those other 2, which is are they aligned with our values and how we work at Gusto? And are they really motivated by the problem space that we're focused on? And so early on, I used to interview every person as a part of our early interview process. Then we scaled that to be an interview that we call the VMA, Values and Motivation Alignment Interview. So there's a whole team that's focused on that. So that's kind of one thing that I think a lot of founders can take away as a very actionable thing to make your own. What are your values? How do you screen for them? How do you make sure someone joining your team aligns with your values? And if someone doesn't align with your values, they're not a bad person. It just means they would do better work in a different company. So I think that's one dimension of scaling that's really, really important, and has been at Gusto at least. Another is how we communicate and how we share. And I really loved, and it still happens today, from the early days at Gusto, we do all hands every 2 weeks. It's a chance to talk about how we're performing, key topics for all Gusties to be aware of. It obviously shifted a lot with the pandemic. We went fully Zoom. Now we're coming back to some of it being in person. But I think finding whatever way is natural, whether it's through asynchronous Slack or even Loom video updates, doing live conversations, Q&A. I think a big part of scaling is making sure when you're at bigger scale, leaders especially don't end up on an island or kind of in an echo chamber. We try to operationalize, connection to customer for everyone in the company through shadowing. I'm actually running payroll right now for one of my customers who's a friend using Gusto. So I think there's just a lot of really important stuff around maintaining proximity to customer as a company scales. And you can actually operationalize that in a pretty tactical way. It doesn't just have to be an idea.
And I know we're running out of time, but as a co-founder in the early days of Gusto, how did you all decide who was going to be CEO? Was there any drama or what was going on?
No drama, but definitely open, direct conversation. I think that's the most important thing. As a founder group, especially, the number of amazing early stage companies I meet that have really interesting markets, really interesting products, and then you learn a year or 2 later, it kind of fell apart due to ego or some type of internal friction, right? It's so frustrating because that business could have been successful, but communication broke down, trust broke down, and then all of a sudden, there was a schism or a divorce inside the company between founders, and all of a sudden the company, needed to shut down. So I think just like any good, healthy relationship, having direct, open dialogue is super important on any topic. On the role topic, we had a direct conversation around what are our strengths, what are our areas of interest. How do we play to those strengths and interests? And basically decided that I would be CEO. Tomer and Eddie early on focused more on product and engineering and the holistic customer experience. I focused more on go-to-market, right? Because being CEO doesn't mean anything early on. And we don't even use C titles inside Gusto. We just use head of titles. But I focused more on go-to-market, distribution, customer acquisition, and more on the operations side. And then once you get past that early stage, it's now how do we build out a leadership team to complement and augment what we're doing here today. I think it's amazing if founders can scale inside a company. It's been really cool 13 years in for Tomer, Eddie, and I to kind of even grow closer, frankly. We deeply care about the mission, purpose. We've all tried to grow and gain more scale through lots of good questions and growth mindset and just being very curious. And both of them are, again, very involved in Gusto today and key roles inside the organization.
It's so rare that we have a company on that has been around for as long as you guys have, that does have sort of all the co-founders still involved in like a substantial way. I mean, some do, but it's like X does 2 days a week, or like someone comes in for big decisions, but nothing else. Why do you think you guys have been able to figure out a system where everyone did want to kind of stay involved in the way that they did to the point you guys have grown to now?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe 2 ingredients I alluded to, but I'll really reinforce. And this is just coincidental, and I'm really grateful for it. But like the journey I described, where I kind of was in my later 20s, had a prior startup, wanted to tackle a problem that I could spend the rest of my life making better. Tomer and Eddie happened to map to that exact same journey. They had prior startups. They wanted to tackle something that they could spend the rest of their professional life making better. So I think there was just alignment early on. Like nothing is guaranteed, but we could spend decades doing this. That was kind of, for all 3 of us, our aspiration and ideal. And so that was one big kind of ingredient. Then we had to go actually build something useful, deliver value to the customer, actually prove a business model that was going to be a viable business, and then scale that. And then once we're in scaling mode, I think the other big ingredient is that curiosity, that growth mindset, that desire to improve. Like I yearn for feedback. I also have lots of ideas and thoughts on how we can make Gusto even better going forward. But I learned from my leadership team. I learned from external stakeholders. And Tomer and Eddie just mapped to the same dynamic. I think that's probably the biggest reason why we could stay so committed and involved 13 years in. I think a lot of times founders either don't have that same curiosity or they become curious in something else, which is fine too. And then all of a sudden they're no longer the right person or the right kind of leader to be involved in the company for this next stage. And or their interest in the mission kind of wanes. Again, I'm grateful for what we're trying to do. We just feel like we're early. 13 years, yes, sounds like a lot of time. I started the company, not married, now I'm married, have 4 kids. There's a lot of life that's happened in that time period. I have some white hair now, but like the chance to go help a lot more businesses and solve more pain in their life, like this is what gives all 3 of us, and actually a lot of Gusties, just a lot of joy. Like we love being of service. We love fixing stuff in people's lives. And the truth is we're still early. If you look at market share, wallet share, the product mix we have live today, there's just a lot more work to do. So we're eager to go get that work done.
Definitely. Well, that sounds like a perfect place to wrap. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Josh. This has been really fun.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
And that was our conversation with Josh. Dom, what was the lie?
The lie was that this was Josh's first company. This is actually his second.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting when he talked about that company in the middle and some of like the nonprofit work he did before and kind of how it shaped how he feels like you have to be passionate about the company that you're building to launch it. That makes a lot of sense because you do see some founders stick with the companies forever. Like think of how long Jeff Bezos was with Amazon or Steve Jobs was with Apple. But then you think of other companies and it's like they hit like the Series D and the CEO founder steps away, which is fine, but it is an interesting point.
No, yeah, it definitely helps to be passionate about the company because I know there are a lot of founders, or maybe not so much anymore, or maybe still very much so, that are just like, I'm going to start a company and get rich. And then like their product is like, what is this product you were trying to sell me? Or you can tell when a founder just does not care about what they're building. And it's really sad.
No, I definitely think of like the people who come to mind first are like the Web3 founders who are now all building an AI. And it's like, oh, I thought you wanted to build a Web3 company. But then it's just like, oh, this new trend came in and now you're building something else. And it's like, okay, well, what if the new trend is like we're going to fintech becomes hot again in 2 years? Are you going to leave the AI company and do that? Which, of course, there's nothing wrong with doing any of these things, but maybe we should have asked them this. But I am curious if like how much investors care about that. I'm sure they'll say that they care and most of them don't.
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, working at a nonprofit is a good place to, I guess, figure this out because nonprofits are not easy to work at. So good for him.
Yeah. Yeah, he's right. Good way to kind of marry those kind of things together. But I also just thought it was interesting the way he talked about competition. He did acknowledge there was competition, but he talked about how like the category has always had legacy companies, but in theory, startups disrupt legacy companies, so that's always a thing. Like I feel like he could have talked or acknowledged more about like the other startups building in this space, because it feels like, especially post-COVID, it feels like there's so many.
I know. I'm obsessed with this kind of like Cold War going on. I was expecting him to name one company in particular, maybe, kind of. I don't know. I would have named, I don't know, but I named names, I guess.
Yeah.
I was like, say the name.
No, I mean, you're totally right. It's been a space. I remember even in like 2021, especially the like remote payroll type of deal. I just got like tired of covering them. There were just so many. And they'd be like, hey, we saw you wrote about Papaya Global. Like, maybe you want to write about these other 4 that are like trying to do something similar. And it's like, well, no, thank you.
But Gusta's been around for a while.
Oh, yeah. No, that's not to say that they're not doing well or anything like that. I believe them that they are. Like you said, they have been around for this long. But it is interesting, those kinds of spaces where it's like literally payroll and healthcare benefits and stuff like are regulated industries, which of course gives a company a moat in the sense that not everyone is going to put the time and the effort to set up companies that have to follow those kind of guidelines. But at the same time, that means all the companies have to follow the same guidelines. So it's like, you really can't be like, oh, we're approaching this from this totally different way. Cause it's like, I feel like people kind of just want to get paid on time and paid correctly. Like there isn't as much flexibility or opportunity to like do like a creative approach.
Yeah, you can't really be different because the industry is so regulated.
Right.
And if you're doing something different, that's suspicious.
Right.
But I mean, that actually is a really good point. I mean, anything with compliance like that seems so just hard. I can't even imagine like 50 different states, 50 different things to know. Like that's insane.
No, truly, reporting on that piece I put out about a month ago about startup compliance, it was just wild. I feel like every single person I talked to, it was like, oh, actually, this is 15 times more complicated than the last person you spoke to made it seem. Just every person I've talked to about it since, they're like, oh, have you even looked into this area? Like, oh, did you even know like this is a rule if you make under this amount of revenue and this is a rule if you make over this amount of revenue? And I was just like, I get why companies hire people to do this for them. Like, this seems horrible to figure out.
And imagine like starting a company in this area and you just like don't care. Like, I don't know if I could,
right.
I'd be like, oh my gosh, like I literally don't care. It's too much work. I would hire someone else to do it for me.
No, and that's something that came up in some of the calls I had where they were saying things like, you want to be like, why didn't companies put a ton of money and effort into this in the beginning? But at the same time, it's like companies don't have a lot of funding. So it's like if they put a ton of their funding money into doing stuff like this and not into their product and they don't end up with a product, like that isn't exactly money well spent either. So it's good there are so many companies building in this space, but it does draw the question of kind of like, not necessarily one winner, but like who does kind of take the top spots at the end of the day.
Yeah, I know. I mean, does there need to be a winner? Maybe there's just competition is good, right?
No, competition is good. And maybe they all have little niches that are enough to set them on their own. Like they're focused on small business. Of course, other companies could put more of a focus on that, but maybe they won't. And maybe they'll be able to really like own that market, which it seems like they are already. But like I said, you never know because people can move into other spaces.
Well, I'm just glad, I guess, to see someone tackling what was once such a manual process like this. I can't even imagine doing all of these things by hand and calculating payroll specifically and stuff like that. So good to see some tasks being automated like this. I wonder how AI, I guess, will further disrupt this space. How can AI further disrupt the compliance space or the enterprise SaaS space?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, from talking about people with at least like even like payroll taxes, depending on what state you're in, there's only so much technology you can do at the moment. Like if you file or have employees in Illinois, you need to send everything to them by the mail.
Ooh.
Not email, the physical mail. So it's like AI can't help you with that. So it's just like, it'll be interesting as like regulations keep changing and as states keep changing what they need to for stuff like this. It will be interesting to see how much like AI can play a role as stuff does become more tech advanced in general.
That'll be interesting. Well, we'll be waiting. And oh my gosh, imagine like getting a stamp to do all this stuff. I feel like I'm just learning how stamps work. I'm like the mail, question mark. What?
Imagine buying a stamp.
Imagine buying a stamp.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Skutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.